All right. Welcome everybody to our June Texas Master Naturalist Tuesday event, our TMN Tuesday event. We have a fantastic speaker with us today to talk about plant ecology. Before we get into the content of our meeting and a little bit about our speaker, we want to make sure that you are hearing everything and participating in the best way for our meeting today. If this is your first TMN Tuesday event, welcome. If this is I don't know how many we've done now, we're on year 3 now, um, then you should recognize a lot of this stuff already. But as an attendee, don't worry, you cannot unmute and you cannot show your video, and that is on purpose. We typically have hundreds, if not thousands, on these webinar events. So we want to make sure that we're giving our speaker that chance to have that focus on their presentation and their content. If you are seeing the advanced slides and you're still not able to hear us, you'll need to check your audio settings. WebEx does like to change their setup every now and then, so you'll want to make sure that you have reestablished your audio settings for your speakers. I even had an issue with it this morning, and so hopefully you are seeing this screen. You're not hearing me, but you're seeing the screen and fixing your audio connection already. All right, and then as we are not able to unmute our attendees and not able to share your video, the way that you're going to interact with our speaker today is you're going to use chat. Use that chat to everyone feature and help Michelle and I moderate the chat room by asking your questions in full and complete sentences, the best spelling and grammar that you can allow on a Tuesday morning, so that we can ask that question of our speaker and get the answer that you're wanting to hear. And then please keep all chat professional, respectful, and on topic. Last but not least, in our tech warm-up, we do have a help call center and a help FAQ page that is on our website as well. So if you are still experiencing WebEx issues, you can check that resource out. All right. Wrapping up the etiquette for today's event. As always, the chat function is where you're going to be communicating with our speaker. We are going to run this session close to an hour, and the recording has started. I typically can get the recordings onto the website by later this afternoon. If not, it'll be first thing tomorrow that today's recording will be posted. And I'll share the link for that TMN Tuesday website in the chat so that you have that readily available. All right, Michelle, I'm kicking it off to you.
Okay, so we're happy to have Tim Siegman as our speaker for our TMN June. I'm bouncing ahead of myself. June, July, where am I? It's summer. Our June TMN Tuesday speaker today. And before we get started, I'd like everyone to know and wish Tim a very happy birthday. Today's his birthday, and we gave him this great gift of doing TMN Tuesday on his birthday. Thank you, Tim.
Thank
you. I couldn't think of a better gift than to let you geek out about plants for an hour, Tim.
Amen.
So, Tim, following the slides, our Texas Master Naturalist TMN Tuesdays are offered Tuesday of the month. If you're new to the program and you're finding this topic interesting, we encourage you to be a part of us. Obviously, you have an interest in natural resources. We'd love for you to be a part of our program. If you're in Texas, you can find your local chapter on our state website. The address is there on the slide. Each of those little sections is a chapter, and we have currently 48 of them across the state that you could become involved in. So find your local chapter, sign up for their training, and get involved with us if you're not already. If you are already involved with us, this counts as advanced training for the Master Naturalist program. Training could be up to an hour, typically about an hour. These TMN Tuesdays live events are about an hour. Tim may have a little bit more content today and could go over. And there could be I know there's going to be some really excellent questions about plants for Tim. So that could take us a little past 1 o'clock as well. This is part of our TMN Tuesday series. This is our June event. You can obviously see our schedule coming up for the rest of the year. We do these once a month, typically on the second Tuesday of the month, with some variations throughout the year, accounting for the summer schedule and then our annual meeting coming up in October. So you can find more out about our TMN Tuesdays events on our website, same address. And welcoming Tim again to talk about what this session has been named a couple different titles. Plants 201. Today we're landing on the plant ecology, right?
Correct.
Something around there.
Yeah.
Tim works for Texas Parks and Wildlife. He's our private lands program leader. Jason Singhurst is not able to join us today. But I'm sure he can help contribute to this program as well. We hope to have Jason back maybe in the fall, but Tim and Jason both work closely together on several different projects within the agency. So happy to have Tim share his expertise and knowledge with us today.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate the introduction, and even took my picture up there from Northeast Texas here this last little bit. So as I said, Jason Singhurst was supposed to help me with this, and so we were going to go and do a little deeper dive into some plant ecology topics where he was going to focus on some identification and how plants grow, and I was going to go into a little bit of a field ecology. And so he actually is in the process of closing on a home, and so he wasn't able to make it today last minute. So I'm going to focus a little bit more on the field ecology and really highlight a project that I've been working on for about the last 9 years. And this project focuses on a process that we call patch burn grazing. And what it really does is the targeted use of fire and grazing together to mimic the natural disturbance regimes that would have occurred on prairies across the state of Texas, not in any particular ecoregion, but across the state. And then talk about the ecology that we use, not necessarily for only one particular species, but for the prairie system in general, especially as it currently exists in Texas. There are remnants. They're usually relatively disjointed and far apart. There's not a lot of connectivity. Most of our landscape is heavily disturbed in some way, shape, or form, from brush encroachment, from agricultural activities, from urbanization, etc. And so this seeks to take some of those areas that aren't in quite as good a shape, or maybe even slightly invaded by invasive species, and use the natural disturbance regimes to mimic the needs of the habitat for the wildlife species and pollinators that still exist on the landscape. So we'll get into that. And then as Mayor, yes.
Did you have slides you were referring to?
No. I'm just giving a preface. I'm about to share it.
Sorry.
So, but I know there's going to be a lot of questions. I'm a fairly fast talker. Am I coming across clear enough with speech? Okay. But I'm a fairly fast talker, so I apologize for that. But I will try to address any questions you'll have. And I have a tendency to go long, so rein me in or give me a heads up with about 5 or 10 minutes left to go. So. Here we go. All right. All good? Y'all can see it?
Looks good.
All right, perfect. So when we think about a prairie, something that a lot of you folks may think of is something that's more typical of what we call a plain, a grass-filled, treeless landscape. Most of Texas, our prairies were fairly, I wouldn't say heavily treed, but bisected by creeks, major rivers, inclusions of rocky soils that didn't favor grass and maybe favored woody shrubs, particularly in the Blackland prairies, the rolling plains, the cross timbers, portions of the hill country, and so on. The only really true treeless plains would have occurred in the high plains of Texas and maybe portions of the coastal prairie. Other than that, our grasslands, while they were still relatively large by today's measures, a few hundred acres to multiple tens of thousands, they've usually now been kind of restricted to much smaller areas. And so what we're looking at here is really a way of using patch burn grazing. And in this example, we did it in the Texas Blackland Prairie, and we're trying to rekindle those ecosystem interactions, the soils, the insects, the birds, the mammals, etc., by putting some of these natural disturbance regimes back out onto the landscape. And so when you take a look at the ecoregions of Texas, all the way from the East Texas piney woods to the coastal prairies and all the way out to West Texas, Texas is pretty much a prairie state. So even in East Texas, until the invention of pine plantations and those types of things, the descriptions of most of East Texas was what they called pine barrens or open pine savannas. So longleaf pine, shortleaf pine savannas that had a very diverse understory of hundreds of species of herbaceous plants, pitcher plant seeps and bogs, sundews, rattlesnake master, little blue stem, all those sorts of things, wiregrass, Northeast Texas, Sylvius dropseed, the post oak savanna, coastal prairie, very rich open grassland with atwater prairie chickens, all the way out to West Texas with the short and mid-grass prairies out there, and even the Trans-Pecos and some of our grasslands out there in Marfa and Hudspeth and so on, Hudspeth County and so on, would have been grama based, but still short grass prairies, very diverse and true grasslands. And so Texas is a prairie state. And so when we look at the descriptions from some of the settlers, this was in 1848, so just about 12 years after Texas independence. This is up in Grayson County, north of Dallas, close to the Red River, and this is kind of the northern edge of the Blackland Prairie. He wrote, "I can sit on my porch before my door and see miles of the most beautiful prairie, interwoven with groves of timber, surpassing in my idea the beauties of the sea. Think of seeing a tract of land on a slight incline, covered with flowers and rich meadow grass for 12 to 20 miles." So just unbroken native habitat types here. At this point, bison were still as close as Fort Worth, Dallas area, still reported into the late 1840s. Into 1856, Frederick Law Olmsted has a great book called A Saddle Trip Across the Southwest. This is the gentleman who ended up being the father of landscape architecture, designed Central Park, designed the Biltmore Estate in North Carolina. He took a trip from Nacogdoches all the way down to Piedras Negras, and then back across the southern portions of Texas over to San Antonio, Seguin, and into Houston, and wrote about his travels. It's a great book that you can still find on Amazon. But this was January 3rd of 1856 near Leon County. So Centerville is right on I-45 between the towns of Madisonville and Buffalo. And so it's during the first part of the day, we went over small, level, wet prairies irregularly skirted by heavy timber with occasional isolated clumps and scattered bushes. Most of the prairies have been burned over, so we're still having some of the natural disturbance and fire ecology here. Both yesterday and today, we have been surrounded by the glare of fires at night. The grass is coarse and reedy and exceedingly dry. We shot a few quails, which are very common, and saw several times turkeys and wild geese. A little further on in the month, as he's crossing the Brazos River, basically between Hearn and College Station, going towards Caldwell, there along modern-day OSR or Highway 21. It says, near the Navasota River, we rejoined the regular San Antonio Road and came out upon large open prairies with long and heavy skirts of timber. And this description applies to the whole region as far as the Colorado. The prairies, as you proceed westward, growing more and more extensive and the proportion of wooded land smaller. So here he is traveling from Seguin to Gonzales in early February. It says, today, this is one of my best favorite descriptions of Texas in the spring. It says, today the genial sun warmed the fresh moistened soil and 3 or 4 more species opened into bloom. After this, hardly a day passed without some addition, and very soon it was impossible to welcome each newcomer. The whole prairie is becoming radiant and delicious. The beauty of the spring prairies has never been and never will be expressed. It is inexpressible. We saw a little bit of this in 2021 and again this year in 2023 with the great spring rains we had in April and May. A phenomenal wildflower display across much of the eastern portions, especially the north central portions of the state. A quick flush spread over all the bosom of old Mother Earth and seemed to swell with life. In another day, the elm buds were green and bursting, and the wild plum and fragrant blossom. The dreary, burnt prairies from repulsive black changed at once to a vivid green, like that of a young wheat. The cheering effect I leave to be imagined. The herds all left the dry sedge and flocked to the new pastures. And this is what we're going to talk about with the patch burn grazing. The herds all left the dry sedge and flocked to the new pastures. The unburnt districts, covered with the thick mat of last year's growth, were a month behind. And so when we talk about spring in Texas, we often evoke, blue bonnets and those sorts of things. And so you can see here, this is a picture from Ellis County, just south of Dallas, near where I-35 splits, near the town of Hillsboro and so on. This is directly between the split, but there are some bluebonnets in there, but there's also antelope horn milkweed, two-leaf senna, some four-nerve daisy, some Texas false dandelion, and others. And this is about a 3,000 acre place that's still relatively intact. This is down in Washington County in June of 2021, a rattlesnake master and all sorts of other things mixed in. And so we have these really diverse multi-species prairies that are full of climax perennial forbs that have been there for years and years and will bloom, whether it's dry or wet. We'll have annual flushes of things like coreopsis and black-eyed Susans and bee balms and those types of things in good years. Bunch grasses with residual cover for nesting. This is a native grass hayfield near Washington County with good, you can see there's a couple of different swatches of different types of plants in that one. This is in Navarro County, showing that mix of brush and native grasses there. Just a good mix of tall purple wine cup, and then a lot of the coreopsis species there in this photo. Here, mealy blue slage mixed in with some grasses and forbs. And even these chalky hills, which a lot of times, so White Rock Lake in Dallas, if you live there, it's the same Austin chalk system that you see here. This is in western Ellis County. And so in the foreground right there on the right-hand side, that's compass plant. On the left-hand side, you get large fruited primrose. There's a lot of New Jersey tea. A lot of others, some Hall's prairie clover here, which is a Texas endemic, those types of things. And so these would have been largely still vegetated and not as barren as you see in some landscapes today. So a lot of barber's buttons in this photo, skullcap, and so on. And here's, again, Washington County. You can see what they were talking about. So those interwoven creek areas, and then the heights would have been prairie, just a really good open, I mean, just beautiful view. You can see why so many people from Houston want to move west to that Brenham, Round Top, Ledbetter area, and why it goes for such a high dollar. Just great views. Still some good prairies left there, a lot of it being converted. But some of those descriptions, here's Jason Singhurst. I put some pictures of him in here since he couldn't be here today. But just a nice little blue stem, partridge tree mixed prairie in Washington County. And some of those descriptions that we talk about when they talk about the big blue stem being belly deep or head high as a man on a horse. I'm about 5'9", and you can see some of that big blue stem in this photo. This was in July of 2021, is even with my head or maybe a little higher here. And in some places it was over 8 feet tall. So just a really robust, healthy prairie system. And so the historic drivers that allowed these things to flourish would have been drought. Periodic drought would have kept these brush species and large trees out of these systems. The soils themselves, a lot of times, would have, especially if you're talking about the Blackland Prairie, with its large shrink swell potential. Anybody who lives in the Blackland Prairie can tell you last summer, some areas I went to would have a 2 or 3 inch crack in the ground when we were really dry at the height of that. And then when it begins to rain again, they swell shut and those things close up. And that shifting soil can cause problems with trees and the roots that they have, breaking them and making them more susceptible to wind throw or to disease. If you have a house built on it, it can cause problems structurally as well with that shifting soil. And so drought, periodic grazing by bison and eventually by wild cattle, domestic cattle, and fire would have been the things that were driving these plant systems. Now we have a number of different other disturbances that can also affect it. So we lose some of our perennial plants, in this example, when it's being plowed for agriculture. And so we have something more like this. All these photos are taken from the same point. So if I'm looking to my left here, that's a colony of big blue stem, native big blue stem on the side of the road near the Falls, Milam, and Bell County line, about 10 miles east of Temple. And so a big colony of big blue stem in the ditch, and across from us, a pasture of cool season winter rye. On the other side, plowed ground preparing for the spring with a tree line of trees that probably wouldn't have been there up on the hillside historically. And then homes coming in closer to the paved road on the other side, along with mostly invasive grasses in the ditch. Most of that's old world blue stems. And then on the backside, that's a grassland restoration we had done in a former crop field. That is very rare on the landscape. But these restorations only make up a small percentage, and we can't expect everybody to go from this to that, which is what we did. So these landowners had owned this land for over 80 years in their family. And when they took ownership, They were tired of the row crop and wanted to enjoy it for other reasons. And they decided to go from no-till corn to this native grassland restoration. And so that's what we did there. And so while we can't expect everyone to want to do a full-on restoration, there are very few remnants left on, especially east of I-35. There's fewer folks who want to spend the money themselves to be able to do a restoration. It can cost hundreds of dollars per acre to treat the site and then buy a diverse seed mix to plant it. But there are still tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of acres that are in some state in between. And so this is an example of a pasture in Navarro County, right on the, actually part of it's in Ellis and part of it's in Navarro County in the Texas Blackland Prairie. And we knew that this particular site was really still naturally diverse. So some of those things that we really wanted to see there, some of the perennial forbs, some of the perennial climax native grasses like big bluestem and Indian grass were fairly limited in their distribution and also in their abundance on the site, but they were still there. The difference was it was being grazed intensively. And so this landowner was interested in wildlife, but if there was a deer fawn or a grassland bird nest, like a quail nest or anything like that out there, between me and those cattle, which are about 200 yards away in this photo, you'd basically be able to see it. So that structural visual obstruction cover for nesting, escape cover, etc., was lacking. And generally that happens quite often, particularly when we have drier years. Like in 2022, you probably saw a lot of ground that looked fairly well used, either grazed down to the ground or in some cases even dirt. And so what we wanted to do was, okay, we know this gentleman's not going to invest in any infrastructure. He's probably not going to limit his cattle distribution, but he has plenty of land. Is there something we can do to redistribute the grazing pressure on this property? And so Jay Whiteside, who's a technical guidance biologist in Wildlife District 5, and myself, in visiting some prairie symposiums in Mississippi and Missouri, started to have discussions between one another and also with a gentleman by the name of Chris Helzer, who's with the Nature Conservancy in Nebraska. And we became aware of Chris Helzer's interest in using patch burn grazing along the Platte River and some prairies that the Nature Conservancy manages up there, as well as along the Niobrara River in north central Nebraska. And then really became more interested when we started reading some of Sam Fullendorf's research out of Oklahoma State, talking about the benefits of patch burn grazing for structure, for ground nesting birds and diversity overall and cattle performance and so on. And so we said, well, why can't we do this in Texas, and what can we do to measure it? Because the difference is the use of these prairies, they can be used, they can be grazed heavily. The difference is they need a period of rest. They can't be used continuously year over year, regardless of rainfall and conditions. And so what we're really looking at there is, okay, in this example, this was heavily grazed. You can see all the grass being grazed and those sorts of things. But when you give it that period of rest, you'll get a flush of a lot of the things that are suppressed during periods of heavy grazing, but they need that space to add that diversity long term. Otherwise, it just becomes the monoculture of grass, or it'll transition to brush in areas where you get enough rainfall. And so what we started to do is we wanted to replicate some structure that looked more like this. And so you've got some bare ground, you've got good bunch grasses, you've got a diversity of forbs in that landscape. This is a restoration photo here, not a native landscape. But as an example, in this particular photo, this was in Nebraska when we were on that field trip, both sides of that fence got the same treatment. They were both burned I think in March of that year. This I think would have been in 2014 that we were up there. They were both burned in March of 2014. Closer to where I took the photo was then grazed. Behind the fence was left ungrazed. And so these are two extremes of basically a monoculture of big bluestem, which is virtually impenetrable and would have very little wildlife use, quite honestly. And then on the other side, while there's not much grass, if you look, there's a diversity of forbs, milkweeds, vervains, all sorts of things. And so you use the fire to focus that grazing pressure. And so what is patch burn grazing? And really what you're doing is you're using fire at different times and at different scales to shift the grazing pressure. And what are we trying to accomplish by doing that? We're producing quality livestock forage because we're burning back the old growth and encouraging fresh, new, highly palatable regrowth to come from the base of the plant. We're controlling woody encroachment a lot of times through the burns. We can usually get fairly intense fires if we have a good fuel load to slow down invasion by things like mesquite, uh, Bamelia, hackberries, elm trees, cedars, all those sorts of things. And it creates structural diversity within the vegetation. So we're not trying to burn the entire pasture. We're burning a portion of the pasture because we want to focus grazing there. And by focusing that grazing there, we're giving a rest to the other portions. So it meets the needs of multiple wildlife species. So if you think about something like a killdeer, they like short vegetation, lots of open ground and bare space, and that's where they'll lay their eggs. If you think about something like a meadowlark, they're going to need last year's residual growth to make their nest in. There needs to be enough dead grass for them to make a cup in the ground and have overhead cover to be hidden from predators. And that's where they're going to make theirs. By the same token, if you're thinking about something like a quail, they need a combination of both. They need a place to make a nest, but they also need enough bare ground and open areas around where they can walk through and take their chicks and be able to find seeds and so on. And so you need those things in close proximity. So the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, I know this is a little difficult to read here, and I'll try to cover as much as I can, but it says grassland ecosystems are dependent on periodic disturbance for habitat maintenance. As a result, management of grassland areas is best directed towards the creation of a mosaic of grassland habitat types. This habitat mosaic is probably best maintained through some type of rotational management system in which sections of large grassland areas receive management on a regular schedule. Such a rotational system would provide a variety of habitat types in every year, would ensure the availability of suitable habitat for birds at either end of the grassland management spectrum, and also would provide habitat for birds whose preferences lie between these extremes. So we need that nesting, brood rearing, and screening cover. If you think about quail and things like that, needing those in close proximity. Habitat patches. So we need those multiple habitats in a single location or patch, which allows the use for multiple species. And so we have foraging locations that could be bare ground where carnivorous birds like mourning doves, they're not very good scratchers and don't like deep litter layers, so they can go on that bare ground and find seeds. We can produce some generally burned areas. We'll produce more invertebrates that can exist there. Sometimes some of them like shady environments, some like sunny environments, some exist on tall vegetation, some on short vegetation. You have specialists, you're creating that diversity of the prey base for especially for your birds and even small mammals. And then pollinators will have annual species blooming, perennial species blooming. When you burn, you can favor sometimes legumes. And so we'll have different types of flowering plants out there, some that favor bees, some with composite flowers that favor butterflies, some with small flowers that favor solitary pollinators, some with lots of blooms that favor colony pollinators like bumblebees or European honeybees. And then germination opportunities. Basically, you're opening up competition by getting rid of some of the competition and creating more root and light space for these plants to exist. So less competition for moisture and nutrients. So basically, to really summarize this in a simple form, if you hadn't burned or done anything or grazed it in 8, 9, 10 years and you had a bunch of just tall perennial grass, dead thatch, by doing this patch burn grazing, just burning, or doing both, you're knocking down that overhead competition, which by proxy would also reduce the root mass in the soil and opening it up to increase the diversity overall. Now, I'm sure you're saying, could this cause problems with invasive species? Yes, it could. And so that's something you have to take into account. If you've got real problems with an invasive grass or an invasive grass is dominant out there, or this is a really rare remnant that has lots of floral diversity and lots of rare plants, this may not be a practice that you want to do. But remember, the example we're giving here is this is a heavily impacted system already through grazing and those types of things. And so what we're really looking at here is more or less trying to improve the structure of an already really impacted system so it has more use for wildlife and pollinators than it currently does. So this is a great example of when you basically have, it's a really famous picture that a lot of folks use, but when you go from no grazing, when you reduce 50% of the overhead canopy each time, you can see the reduction in root mass and the ability of that plant to recover. It reduces over time. And so the usefulness of patch burn grazing as a tool basically focuses on trying to optimize sustainable livestock production objectives, which this landowner had, and we're trying to maximize the habitat conditions for the different animals that need various things. So we have animal species on this landscape who need heavily impacted rangelands and lightly impacted rangelands. And by using patch burn grazing, we're trying to allow space for all of those things on a single pasture. So this can also be affected not just by animal preferences for the whole year, but also seasonally within a season. So there's a lot going on here. So for landowners, how does this affect cattle performance? And so in general, these research papers listed there at the bottom, they found that cattle performance in pastures managed with patch burn grazing did not differ from that found in pastures managed with the traditional range management strategy. So what they did in their study region, they were able to maintain the levels of cattle performance they're accustomed to, while also increasing the wildlife habitat that they're focused on, and more so, that was done in where traditional techniques would not have happened. And these results were affirmed from other studies in Oklahoma and Colorado. So basically, I'm setting the table for a whole lot of other stuff we're going to be talking about here. So patch burn grazing is not a panacea. It's not going to fix everything you can do, but it is an example of a tool that you can use. So this landowner did not want to invest in the infrastructure it would take to begin to parcel out these pastures for a rotational grazing system, or invest in the water tanks and piping he would need for supplemental water. So we eliminated the need to fence, depending where you're at and how much fence you're building and how far the person has to drive and those sorts of things. The estimated cost for a 5-strand barbed wire fence, depending where you're at, can be for as little as $3 to as much as $7 a foot. You know, if they're coming out and only building a couple of 100 feet, you're going to get charged a lot more than if they're on a per foot basis and they're building a couple of miles. But if you take that as an example, a 1/4 mile of fence, 5 wires, would run you somewhere between almost $4,000 and just a little over $9,000. So if he was building multiples of these, he'd be spending a few $1,000s to be able to divide up his grazing with unknown returns. Brush control. This is another example of things that are going to be invading, that'll be an additional cost besides what we're going to be doing. You're either spending money on herbicides or some other methodology to try to treat that. And meanwhile, when they do invade, you're losing productivity on your rangelands. You're producing less grass. So some studies have shown a reduction in parasite loading. So by burning, you can reduce the egg loading. We can burn up some of the cow pies that may be responsible for horn flies as well by concentrating the cattle into a single area. Other portions of the prairie won't have as many of these fly larvae and other things available if they are moving around, because the cow pats are focused in one particular area during that time. And so I've seen there's been a couple of questions in the text about stocking rates. So stocking rates will vary. So it depends on the individual's need for income and what they are acceptable impacts to the vegetation and other resources on the property. Stocking rates are never a set rate. It's always going to be variable based on growing conditions. Last year, the stocking rate on these pastures would have been very low. We had over 50 days of 100-degree temperatures and virtually no rainfall from late May until the middle of August. This year, the stocking rate would probably be very high. Some of these areas have received over 20 to 25 inches of rain in the last 4 months. So it's really going to depend. So what it does do for you is you have a lot of flexibility. You can decide how big your burn's going to be, when you're going to burn, how often. Are you burning once a year? Are you burning once in the winter and once in the summer to change grazing pressure over time? What's your ability to move cattle? Do you live on site or do you live off somewhere else and have somebody managing for you? You can respond to drought. Can you take the animals off? Can you respond when you're planning to burn and all of a sudden you're in a burn ban and cannot? Do you have the ability to respond to abundant rainfall when it's wetter than normal? And then the scale. Is this just for a single pasture because you have multiple hundreds of acres? Or is this done on the entire property because all you have is, 25 or less? And then rest. how long and how often. Those are all dependent upon your goals and what you're trying to do and the responses you get from the parcel you manage. It's very, very different if I was doing this out in Amarillo versus if I was doing it in Corsicana versus if I was doing it down on the upper coastal prairie between Houston and Beaumont. You know, you're talking about a 15-inch rainfall zone to a 30-inch rainfall zone to an almost 60-inch rainfall zone. So those factors are not going to be uniform. It's always going to depend, which is a favorite biologist's answer there. So stocking rates are going to have a great impact on your results. Generally, the higher you stock, the more likely you're going to have to rotate them through to somewhere else, and you're going to have higher animal impacts sooner. But those are going to vary by your soil productivity. So clays are usually more productive than deep sands. But again, that's going to vary by rainfall, how warm it is that year or cool, the vegetation that's out there when you start this practice, and so on. What you're trying to do is maximize that impact in the burn zone and minimize that impact outside of the burn zone. There is no magic number. So from a rest standpoint, this is extremely important. It's going to allow those perennial grasses to recover, so you're not doing damage to the overall system. Again, the rest is going to be longer in dry cycles. It's going to be shorter in wet cycles when there's optimal growth going on. And rest is going to be impacted by your stocking rate. So generally, the heavier the grazing pressure, the longer you're going to need to rest it for it to come back into a point of stasis, favoring those perennial climax species again. So in this example, this is the property we did. So that whole yellow square is the entire property. That black hatched area and to the right is one pasture, the yellow hatched area, and to the left is another pasture. And basically what we did was take these pastures and burn 1/3 of them each year. And so by doing that, we were attracting the cattle to the burned areas and resting the other 2/3 of the prairie. And so when we started, this is what it looked like. It looks just like that first picture we gave. We could barely get it to burn. There was so little fuel out there. The pasture that the cattle are in right there had been burned 2 days previous, and they're already in there. That's why there's the black cover. And we were going to burn what is there in the foreground on this day. And so after we burned it, we started doing some vegetation sampling to see if we could track things over time. So we looked at it, 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 measured it, measured it, measured it, measured it. Then we even sat down and looked at it. And so when we were all said and done, we ended up doing about 200 plots across 480 acres. And we've been able to mimic this now for this coming year. We're going to do it July 5th and 6th will be the 9th growing seasons that we've sampled these areas, and we've been able to burn it 8 times over those 9 years. And so what we'll see over time is that the response has generally been good, and we've had a complete change in the structure of this prairie. And not only that, there were a lot of things that we learned we should have measured that improved that we didn't expect. And so Jay Whiteside on the right and Taylor Garrison on the left are the 2 biologists that work this area for Texas Parks and Wildlife. And I put a lot of work into this with me in doing this measurement every year. But also a lot of credit goes to the landowner and then the number of volunteers we have to do the burns. And so this is actually a Texas Master Naturalist right here, Mr. Jim Walton, that I used to do a lot of work with. He came up and did some burning on this property with us. And this was in year 3. So you can see this is the same area I took that first picture in earlier, how much more residual grass cover was there to carry these fires. And so everybody likes to set the fire as we look at that. And so that picture in the background is where Jim had set the fire. And you can see this was about a week after we had burned that first patch. And you can see the cattle in there and the green up that's already occurred. And they're attracted to that fresh burn. Jay is trying to throw up an Axum Jacks right there. He and I are both SFA alums, so setting fire to the prairie here. But I know we were burning this side on this one. This is the second time it would have burned. And so realistically, what you're seeing here is you're trying to burn this area. The burn effects happen. So that burn on the left, that was February 9th. February 10th are the after effects. And then there's pictures of the green up in early April of that same year, and the cattle are focused on that fresh green growth that has occurred in the burn unit. And so here's a great example of what it looks like between the two. So the area to the left, You can see the fire break. It's kind of weaving its way in between the two. The fire break is in the middle where all that bare ground is. The area to the left is the area that's been burned. And the area to the right has all the residual growth from the previous year. And so this is the first year we sampled in 2015, and we could already see an impact from the burning, focusing that cattle grazing. We actually had grass growth up to our knees rather than down below boot level by focusing the grazing in another portion of the prairie. And so there's Jason Singhurst, and that's Dan Jones on the left, who's now retired, and Jay in the middle. And we're trying to measure. We're putting down these meter square plots, and then documenting every species that we find within those plots along the route. And so after that first year, that ground had been so rough and beat up. If you've ever seen Lonesome Dove, and you remember old Pete walking across the prairie after the Native Americans had stripped him of his shoes and forced him to march across, that's how we were walking. Our legs and ankles were worn out. That was some rough as a cob ground with hoof tracks everywhere and us tripping and everything else. We ended up walking about 7 miles across it in one day doing these transects. And it was just extremely difficult to get across because the ground was so beat up and so impacted from cattle impact over the years. And so by the end of the first year, by the end of the first sampling season, this is the opposite end of the prairie from where we had burned. And you can see that's a lot of prairie drop seed. There's a little bit of Indian grass in there, but this was over knee high. And so it was getting very well rested. And so we were able to have the sun set on a good first day of sampling. We were already starting to see some of the results we wanted from getting a different portion of the prairie on the opposite side, the ability to rest. So this is at ecology standpoint. Basically, all these species were here. All we had to do was be able to change one thing by implementing that fire and focusing that grazing pressure, even if it's only for 4 or 5 months till the weather gets warmer and the cattle started focusing more on water and shade in July and August. It was enough to give these plants the ability to produce seed, to make more cover for nesting birds and pollinators and those sorts of things out there. And so we were using this system that I was telling you about, these meter squared plots. It's called plot-wise floristic quality analysis. We were trying to compare species over time, burned to unburned areas, and then how often are these species showing up using these derived, what they call conservatism values for North Central Texas. So if you want to think about something like big blue stem would rank really high on the conservatism scale. It's like an 8. But something like broomweed would be like a 1, because you can find broomweed, in a parking lot, as to where big blue stem is typically only going to be on remnant or relic prairie sites for the most part, or areas with good grazing distribution, etc. So after the first year, this is what we found. We had a largely annual plant community, with most of our native grasses being cool season grasses. So if you look at the left-hand side where it says East Pasture, Desmanthus leptolobus, that's prairie bundleflower. That's a cousin of Illinois bundleflower. Bromus catharticus, that's smooth or Japanese brome. That's going to be one of those. It's actually Bromus japonicus now that we named it. So Japanese brome, cool season, non-native annual grass. Croton, that's there, that's single seed croton. The next one is broomweed, then snow, Euphorbia bicolor is snow on the prairie. Gaillardia pachella, that's Indian blanket. Nacella leucotricha, that's Texas wintergrass. Spiralis compositus, that's prairie drop seed. Plantago rotosperma is red seed plantain. Asclepias viridis is green milkweed, and on and on and on. So basically, the first warm season perennial native grass that we had showed up in only a quarter of our plots, and it was Cytodes grama. Cytodes grama on that particular soil type should be a midgrass making up less than 10%. So what it tells us is this has been heavily grazed for a long period of time. And if our dominant warm season native grass is that, we've got a long way to go to get back to that climax plant community. And so here's an example of some of those conservatism scores for Northeast Texas. So you can see something like broadleaf false aloe is a 10, while down there in the middle somewhere would be, something like Queen Anne's lace would be like a negative because it's a non-native. Or something like Texas prairie parsley, that Paulownia natale, would be like a 5. It's a good prairie plant, but you can find it on some degraded sites too. So those are some examples. So when we start looking between 2015 and 2016, we could already see some moves. So you can see the first year we had it 93 plots. The next year was already knocked down to 84 for some of those. And so that one in particular, the prairie bundleflower, In the first year, it was in 93 of the plots and probably made up to 50% of the cover in some of them. In the second year, it was down to 84 of the plots, but it was making up generally less than 10% because we had such a recovery in the grasses overall. So that was fairly interesting to see that change over time. But the other thing that we noticed that we didn't take any real measurements of was there was a huge increase in the invertebrates. So here's a picture of my old, Danner boots there with a little moth caterpillar on it. But we saw a big increase in caterpillars that were out there, a big increase in pollinators, a very large increase in the ability of the forbs to be able to produce seed and maximize their abilities on the prairie. So Indian blankets became very abundant. Bladderpod, Maximilian sunflower showed up for the first time, and that was on year 3 that we really saw it ever out on the prairie. This is actually not Dahlia purpurea, it's a Dahlia compacta, which is a different species of prairie clover that's also purple that's spread throughout there. Dahlia eniandra, or big top dahlia, or 9-anther dahlia. This is usually more common in the cross timbers or rolling plains. American basket flower became much more abundant, and the insects that come with it. And then instead of just spotting big blue stem vegetatively, because we were starting to get some rest, they were finally able actually to start producing seed on a semi-annual, or basically on a biannual basis. So previously it was getting grazed so hard, while we could see those things were there, they were rarely or just sparsely able to actually produce a seed head that wouldn't get grazed off. So by focusing that grazing pressure elsewhere, we were able to get these things to start propagating themselves and spreading. So the colonies of these plants were getting bigger, particularly big bluestem and Indian grass. Colonies are spreading and getting larger. They're producing more seed. Little bluestem and Cytoscrama making good seed. And here's a big colony of Cytoscrama on the prairie hilltop there. And if you notice, that's a mesquite skeleton in the middle that's been starting to succumb to the repeated burnings. And then we even had switchgrass show up in a few spots, which was fairly rare for this site. And I think that was year 6 when we noticed it for the first time. But then also across the prairie, we're having big effects on the woody encroachment. So you can see we had top killed this mesquite that was about 6 to 8 feet tall. It's still resprouting from the base, but we're getting rid of it over time. If we were able to continue to burn, eventually it would probably die out. On top of that, we're increasing the abilities of the biologists working the area to identify species and understand the ecology that comes with this. So Jason Singhurst on the left, Jay Whiteside in the brown shirt, that's Matt Mahashek with the NRCS there in the bottom right, Heidi Bailey in the center in the plaid shirt, and then myself on the right. But that's also an intern in the back named Obed, who was seeing this early on in his career to see how these things could function. So we went from something like this, where it was heavily grazed and really being able to focus that grazing pressure, to now we had other portions of the prairie. This was in 2016, the following year, where we're getting colonies of big bluestem blooming 6 to 7 feet tall. And this is in September of that year. So as an example, this is from Chris Helzer. This is Chris Helzer's prairie up in Nebraska, but they burned it and then grazed it really hard for 3 years, getting the impacts they wanted on this particular site. And then he said, that's enough, we're gonna rest this. And so he burned it again, and then he let it rest for 2 years. And this is the photo in the same location. So the point is to be able to allow these systems to rest and get the diverse response that you want from these plant communities, is mostly perennial forbs in this case that are in this photo. And so the example that we have is, and what I want to say to people is, just because you see a site that's heavily grazed, it doesn't mean that you have to start over. Oftentimes when I go to a person's property, the first thing they see when they see something like this is that they want to be like, oh, it's all gone. Let's just kill it all and we'll plant everything. Well, this was year 3 of our study. So this had been burned that year. So the cattle are focused in that grazing. You can see them in the background in the burn unit. And if you notice, you can see Jay's boot tops, and even the western ragweed there is just over the top of Taylor. So most of the ground cover is less than 8 inches in height, because we had just burned this that February, and the cattle were grazing it heavily as a result of that. So you can see that's a forage stick. There's lots of forbs, still decent grass cover, but prairie petunia, single seed croton, American basket flower, snow on the prairie, broomweed, all good seed producers. This is really good brood rearing habitat for quail. This is an area that a dove might land and try to forage for seeds. Even some areas that were hit really hard with some bare ground. You know, if this happened every single year, that would be bad. But here's a picture from 2 years later where we burned the other portions. We burned the other portions of the prairie in the following years. And so the question there is, so the firstborn growth from the in-ground seed. Yes, there's in-ground seed, but remember, mostly these are perennial plants, and these perennial prairie plants, their bud zone is below the soil surface. So they're coming back from the bud bank that they have underground. Those fires don't burn hot enough or long enough to be able to heat up the soil enough to kill those plants. And so if you look at Jay in that picture, he's holding a yardstick. So this is 2 years later. The cattle were still in this pasture. All we did was burn the other portions and focus the grazing. And if you look close at that yardstick, most of that grass is at about 2 feet in height, spread around him. So all it took was us to focus the grazing pressure somewhere else, and it's able to recover. And those are big blue stem seed heads coming up right there in those pastures. And you can still see a lot of forb diversity in there as well. Those brown spots to the left are American basket flower and Indian blanket all throughout. And so same picture with it laying on the ground and it's fully covered. So now we have good nesting cover, good fawn rearing cover, and those sorts of things. But if you look where we were, this was a different pasture that was burned in 2018. And so you can see lots of green grass coming back. This is about 2 months after we burned it. The cattle are focused to grazing pressure here. I circled a mesquite, dead mesquite there in the background. And if you look, this is the same site 2 years later where it's recovered. There's Heidi and Jason, and what they're pointing at and smiling about is this is in July of 2020. So remember, we started sampling in July of 15. So 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. We've been sampling this pasture for 6 years, and this is the first time we'd ever found pitcher sage, Salvia azurea, growing there. So I circled pitcher sage. That's that mesquite stub in the background. So if you look at it in 2018, the year we burned it, and all we did was burn the other parcels. We didn't remove the cattle. We just focused their grazing pressure, and we have grass that's knee to almost mid-thigh high on Jason and Heidi, and we're still finding new species that are recovering. So we just changed, instead of having the whole pasture available to them for the whole year, by burning a portion of it and focusing that grazing pressure there for a period of time, we're able to release the plants on the other portions throughout. So we're going to continue to do this research. We're going to finish up this summer, and our hopes are to analyze the rest of the data as we go through there. And so basically, from our observational conclusions, patch burn grazing is another tool in the toolbox in the ecology of these plant systems. So prairies are diverse. As we mentioned, remnants are rare, but there's lots of heavily impacted areas that are still predominantly native. And if we can just change the grazing pressure, whether that be through a defined system using cross fencing and water distribution to do it, or by using patch burn grazing, we can achieve effects that fire or grazing can't alone. So there's a synergistic effect between the two that you don't get if you just do one or do the other. So we'll also achieve those secondary goals we talked about. We can get some brush control. We can reduce parasite loading. We can minimize wildfire risk by knocking down some of the residual growth from previous years on those individual areas. We can promote biodiversity. We can increase the usable space for wildlife, and we can still maintain that cattle production. So the end result that we had was we're still able to maintain that cattle production that the landowner wanted, but we've increased the amount of wildlife in the field. Now, we don't have exact numbers because the whole point of this, we didn't get any funding for this. We did it on our own time, and we had to do it all basically in a day and a half time frame for the sampling. We've noticed increases in rainwater infiltration. We've noticed we're still picking up new species 9 years into sampling. We're finding nesting meadowlarks in the field every year, as to where in the past we would not. We've noticed increase in pollinator diversity as well. And so really, it's not any one thing. And as I said, patch burn grazing is not going to be the cure-all for everyone. It is difficult to be able to find a burn contractor if you can't do it yourself. You do have to look for the right weather conditions to be able to pull a burn off. You may have to combat issues with burn bans and things such as that. And so it's really about being flexible and reading that property and the land over time. And so just by keeping records and those photo points, what I try to illustrate to everybody is you learned more from the photo points than what I talked about this entire time. You won't remember most of what I said, but you probably will remember some of the images that I shared. And so I really encourage you as you do your management over time is to document it with photos because we like to think we remember things really well, but we don't. And so I really, really, really encourage you if you're taking on any management practice to take photos of the process so you can see where you came from and understand what you did and go from there. So with that, I'd like to thank the landowner, Mr. Beeson, Jay Whiteside, Taylor Garrison, Heidi, Bobby Alcorn, Matt Mahachek, excuse me, Dan Jones, Charlie Booher, Obed Rodriguez, Jason Singhurst, the Winbury landowners, and me. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions y'all may have.
Tim, there are a lot of questions in the chat that revolve around where can people find more resources on healthy stocking rates, grazing, a grazing plan, and also burning. A lot of the questions I think could be answered on where they could find more resources for that. Every situation is going to be a little different, but where would you direct people?
So there's a lot of different avenues that we could go here in talking about different things. So first I'll say, if you'd like to learn more about patch burn grazing, I would highly suggest Chris Helzer with the Nature Conservancy in Nebraska has a great book. I think it's called Managing Prairies in the Central U.S. or Management and Ecology of Prairies in the Central U.S. or something like that. It's an excellent book that while the species may not be exactly the same as what we're dealing with in Texas, the concepts are invasive species management, managing for resiliency, focusing on if you can graze, do this. If you can't graze, do that. If you can burn, do this. If you can't do that. These are your different options. He has a great blog as well called the Prairie Ecologist blog. He's been writing it since 2012. You could read for months on the things he's written about. It's also excellent photography that covers a lot of the subjects I talked about. There's a great group out of Oklahoma State. Actually, somebody just posted it there, the Prairie Project. That's great. So Oklahoma State and Texas AgriLife Extension are working on this. I'm not working with them directly, Jeff, but I do overlap with a lot of the professionals who are associated with it. The Dr. Stan Elmore and, or Dwayne Elmore, excuse me, and Dr. Fullendorf out of Oklahoma State have a ton of publications about patch burn grazing. They call it Pyrrhic herbivory, which is really good. That is a great resource that talks about some of the benefits and things that they're doing. If you're talking about assistance with prescribed burning in general, Texas Department of Agriculture maintains a list of certified prescribed burn managers on their website where you can look up folks who are able to do these things for you. They can put in fire breaks, they can do the burn, they can write the burn plan. Texas Parks and Wildlife has regional fire coordinators in every region of the state that can be of assistance to implement prescribed fires as well as write prescribed burns, but there are only 4 of them, and then a statewide fire program leader. So if everybody on this webinar, all 450 of you, reached out to them, it may be years before they get to everyone. They just don't have the bandwidth to get all over everybody. But your local Parks and Wildlife biologist could be a resource depending on if they're fire qualified or not. There's some are not. Or local wildlife management areas. There's pretty much one in every ecoregion of the state. If you tour them, so Michelle, you're very familiar with the Kerr WMA where they use prescribed fire. There's biologists out there who would be able to demonstrate to you the effects that they have from their prescribed burns. If you're in East Texas, folks over on the national forests and some of the WMAs over there may be able to help you. If you're in the Post Oak Savannah, Gus Engling WMA near Palestine does a great job. The Daughtry WMA, all of our refuges and WMAs along the coast do a lot of burning, those types of things. There's many individuals who are doing this if you reach out to some of those folks as to what they're doing. Yeah, Tina, Winston 8, great example of folks using prescribed fire. Former Lone Star Land Steward and Leopold Award winner from Parks and Wildlife who do good work over there in East Texas. So basically what I would say is you can reach out to Parks and Wildlife. The Natural Resource Conservation Service has range specialists who do a lot of good work. There's a Grazing Land Coalition that you can reach out to. They have an excellent Facebook page. I think there's one called Texas Rangelands that puts out a lot of good information. I think Jenny Pluhar, I think heads that up with the Society for Range Management. There's probably more information than you can read. And if you're really interested, I'm actually on the planning committee for this. Next summer, there's going to be a, oh goodness, I just completely bombed on, I think it's the Great Plains Fire Science Exchange is going to have a symposium that's going to occur in the town of Canyon up near Amarillo. Basically looking at these things. Right now, they're planning on going to the J.A. Ranch, which is one of the historic Texas ranches up in the Panhandle that utilizes prescribed fire as a part of their operations. Yeah, West Texas Rangelands. Yep, that's great info. Good job, Tina. Thanks for the help. So are there any other specific questions that y'all caught?
There's a couple on tips for suppressing KR with warm season burns.
Okay, so Old World blue stems are very difficult, and this pasture that we did actually does have a fair amount of Old World blue stem in it. A lot of those photos that I took, about a quarter of the plots that we hit have Old World blue stem in it. The difference is it's not a monoculture, it's mixed in. And so that's one of the things that we're focused on. We know that this individual landowner is not going to take the time to eliminate all of the Old World blue stem on his property. It's just not feasible, and it's not profitable. If he had less acreage or was a passion project, there are definitely people who take that step and go and spot spray and do those sorts of things. But in this case, all we're trying to do is manage that structure. So what we've seen is that it's probably not spreading, but we're also not getting rid of it. In this particular case, all we've done is dormant season burns. Most of our burning has occurred between January and April because that's when we were able to get it done. These individuals, we wanted to do a summer burn, but typically this county goes into a burn ban, and we're just not willing to take on the risk for this project, basically. And so our best burning conditions and burning days have occurred during the dormant season, and we focused on it at that time.
There were also lots of questions about the seed bank and whether or not after your burns, was there any seeding at all? And then secondly, kind of a follow-up to that is, what is the longest that you're aware of seed being viable in the seed bank? I think would sum up a few of those questions.
So in this particular pasture, there was no reseeding. The only time he did any reseeding was when he would, the landowner just happened to have some old seed. So when he would put in his burn breaks, he would throw some up behind him to see if it would come up. But it was insignificant in the grand scheme of things. You're talking about a 10-foot disc strip relative to a 240-acre pasture. So relatively insignificant amount of seeding to what we were sampling. We intentionally don't sample the fire breaks because they're not representative of the prairie at large. You're getting an entirely different treatment. So no reseeding. A lot of these things, they can maintain themselves. So there's a question there right now, do seeds remain in the seed bank after 40 years of agriculture in a field? Some. I mean, there's always going to be something come up generally. But a lot of times it's early successional things. What you lose is your really climax species, like things that are really indicative of perennial. So you wouldn't have anything with a bulb. So you think of like gay feather, iris species, those types of things, perennial grasses. You're probably not going to have a lot of that. You may get, I know of a place between where Mary and Pearl and I live near Dime Box that it was a cornfield my entire life. And now there's a gas station right there, Mary Pearl, that brand new one there. That area behind it was a cornfield my entire life for the last 5 years. And it's colonized by bee balm and black-eyed Susan somehow in 5 years. I don't know where it came from, how it got in the field. whatever else, but those are all annual plants. It's mainly non-native grasses that took it over. So in that situation where it's been really impacted that way, you're probably going to have to replant some of those more uh, perennial species. But the longest I know of, so Gus Ingling Wildlife Management Area did a 2,500 acre savanna restoration on the northwest portion of their property. That property was purchased in the 1950s and it slowly became encroached with brush over the time. I did the pre-sampling and this was closed canopy hardwood forest. There was still some of the stuff out there, but most of it was leaf litter underneath and then some really wet site or mesic forest type plants. They removed about 60 to 80% of the overstory trees and started burning a lot and sprayed to kill the resprouts. And there's just a robust amount of little blue stem Indian grass and 200 plus species of native herbaceous plants that blew up afterwards. And it'd probably been 20 to 25 years since some of those areas had seen sunlight. So is it possible for those things to persist? Yes, but it's very dependent on past site history. Even this prairie that we were sampling in this example, it was parceled together from 3 historic ownerships, and we can tell a difference in the plant communities, even though this individual has owned it for 30 years, or 25 years, I think. We can still tell a difference in the plant communities based on historic ownership and what was used there 50, 60, 70 years ago. So that historic use can have a real impact.
How about your sampling sites? How did you choose your square meter sampling sites, and what recommendations or resources would you have for others wanting to do the same?
So basically what we did was we utilized a methodology that Chris Elzer wrote about called plot-wise floristic quality indices. And so some folks, they'll do it and just analyze a whole site. They'll run one transect, write down everything they saw, and say this pasture is ranked a X based on what we saw in this one transect. What we liked about the plots was we could compare burned plots to unburned plots. Were we seeing responses there? Were we seeing, as we continued to sample within certain portions of the prairie, could we see delineations based on those past histories that we talked about? Or were we seeing certain species expand across the prairie that had, during the beginning of the study, only been found in one area, etc.? And so that's what the plots allowed us to do. We could compare within plots, between plots, and then we could put them all together and rank the whole site. And so when we were doing the analyses of how many to do, basically the question was, you want to sample enough until you are running out of new species. And what we found the first year is we did 100 plots, and up until plot 96, we were still adding new species occasionally. So we decided, well, we better keep doing it. And sure enough, the next year we added new species all the way up until plot 89. And so it's like, we just kept with it. And then at that point, we were stuck at 100. But the way we run them, it's not fixed plots. We're running transects. And so, again, Jay and I were both forestry majors. And so in forestry, there's a measurement unit called a chain. And so 10 square chains is an acre. And when you run it that way, if you have 10 square chains and you get that acre, since there was 240 acres in the pastures, we would have 6 chains between transects and 4 chains between plots. So you had a 24 square chain sampling frame. So 2.4 acres, 100 plots, 200, basically 1 sampling point for every 2.4 acres is what you come up with. And so that's how we came up with that sampling methodology. We wanted 100 plots. We knew that there was, we needed 1 per 2.4, 6x4 grid did it. And basically when we get out of the truck in the morning, I have a random number generator and I said, pick a number between 0 and 3. And that's how many chains we go off the one of the corners. And then we pick a number between 0 and 2. And that's how many we come off the fence. And that's our starting point. And then we start running the transects from that point on. I'm good to stay for more questions. I booked all the way till 1:30 for this, so I'm happy to answer.
So there's a couple questions asking on about smaller scale prairies, micro prairies, maybe some things in their backyards. Again, resources and suggestions for that scale as well.
And along those same lines, sorry, for those instances where burning is not available in those smaller environments.
Gotcha. So in that book that I suggested, Chris Elzer's book, if you can't tell, I'm a fanboy of a lot of the stuff that he writes. He's a very good writer showing the benefits. So for example, if you don't have the ability to burn, but you do have the ability to graze, some of the things that he's used, particularly during burn ban periods, is he would mow it. He would mow it high, so not so low that you're damaging some of your grasses, but he would mow it high to encourage a flush of new growth, and the cattle would see, so it'd be, instead of patch burn grazing, it'd be patch mow grazing, and he was utilizing that to focus the grazing pressure. And so in doing that, you're mimicking some of the things that you can get from fire. You don't get the nutrient cycling. You may get some more thatch buildup that you wouldn't by doing burning, but you're at least focusing that grazing pressure the way you want to give those other areas rest. The other thing that I suggest is this is a unit scale thing. So like for me, I've got a little 650 square foot wildscape in my front yard. Generally, I'm doing the same thing to all of it. When I do it, I don't have the ability to break it down. There's not enough site diversity. There's really no need to do anything else. I may leave a few individual plants, particularly if I see something's bored into them or whatever. But most of the time on those smaller instances, I just allow them to be like, all right, I'm going to make a decision of what I'm going to do this year. I just change it up. So some years I clip it high, like I'll hand clip it. I'm that much of a nerd. Other years I'll mow it down to the ground. If I feel like I'm getting too much grass or too many weedy plants I don't want, I'll mow it all the way down to the ground during the winter and try to get a whole bunch of black-eyed Susans and annuals to come back and that sort of thing. And so I just kind of vary it up based on the response I'm getting from that plant community. Like last year I had a really bad drought. I did nothing until November. And then I finally mowed it down, because if I'd have mowed it down earlier or clipped it down like I usually do, it just would have burned up the soil because it was so hot. It just, it wouldn't have done me any good. But I really do suggest, honestly, with all those little smaller examples that they're talking about, if you read Chris Elzer's writing, it's in great detail. It's a resource that you'll have. If you read his Prairie Ecologist blog, a lot of that stuff is in there as you look through it.
There's also been a few questions about how to have conversations with neighbors on intentions for your property, or how to talk to others in your area, or share resources with others. You shared some books that our master naturalists could use, but are there other resources that they could share with their neighbors to let them know what they're doing and why they're doing it?
Yeah, what I always try to tell folks is the wrong way to go about any conversation is to start with, let me tell you what you're doing wrong. That's what I think that's, if you come across as holier than thou, or like, hey, I'm the new person, let me tell you how to do this. That's never really a good way to do it. Leading by example helps. And then, there's a lot of, there's science based on this stuff, trying to find early adopters, people who are kind of innovative and try new things on their own anyways. They're usually the ones to approach, and then people watch them if they have success. There's some other things going on there. If you can demonstrate on a smaller scale that it's successful on your own volition, and the people see what you're doing, and maybe not having to work as hard and still getting some of the same results, they like that too. I do have a list. If you give me a second, I can pull up. I've got another presentation that has 3 slides with resources that I can put up on the screen. I'll do that in just a second. I think Katie Bartush says, do you ever speak for Native Plant Society groups? I have, Katie. I know I spoke to the Fort Worth chapter, I think, earlier this year. I speak a lot to master naturalist groups that are close. Gideon Linscomb chapter, Brazos Valley chapter, the chapter advisor, El Camino Real, and then the chapter out of Bell County. I've just blanked on their name. At a temple.
Goodwater chapter.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, Goodwater, spoke to them.
Central Texas.
Central Texas. Yep, Central Texas. There you go. And then some of the groups down in Houston. But yeah, lots of speaking. Let's see here. Let me see if I can find this real quick.
And then for those master naturalists, while he's looking for that, we're also hoping that, Tim, you could share your slides so that we could post them as PDFs on our website, so folks can grab those links, or if not the whole slide deck, at least the links for some of the resources that you talked about, and we'll put that up on the website.
I certainly can, but the only problem is I don't use notes. So like it's going to be a lot of pictures
Okay.
with no notes. Like all that was off the top of my head. But so apologies for that, but that's just how my brain operates. But one second, get down here to the bottom of this and make sure it's what I want. There we go. It's one of them. Sorry, I'm trying to make sure I've got what I want here. Any other questions that were up that I could help with?
I can look. There was a reference to some of the local prescribed burn associations, but then also to NPAT and other groups that are doing similar type of conservation work. Do you want to talk about some of the other resources for programs that folks can look into for additional help with restoration projects?
Yeah, sure. So let me know when you can see this real quick.
There it is.
So there's some additional ones. So talks about it's not everything, but there's some good ones about Blackland Prairie, Matt White's book. There's a really in-depth restoration manual that's probably more than anybody would ever want to deal with, called the Tallgrass Restoration Handbook. And a really good publication by TMU called Reseeding Natives in South Texas. And then this is a YouTube video that I helped make a few years ago that's decent. So, Mary Pro, can you repeat that question? I'm sorry, I completely blanked.
It's okay. I was leading you on to tell us about other project resources.
Yes, yeah. So the Nature Conservancy in Texas has the Climber Meadow up near Celeste, Texas. That's really excellent. Brandon Belcher up there can get some really good examples of things to do. The Texas City Prairie Preserve and Aaron Magellan over there does a really good job. In East Houston, the U of H Coastal Center will occasionally have field trips. We've done a spring workshop each of the last 2 years. 2 years ago, or last year rather, was in Houston. This past year was in Victoria and Goliad, and we looked at a bunch of prairies around there and what was happening there. We just did a workshop in New Boston in Bowie County with Northeast Tech in Northeast Texas, where we looked at a couple of remnant and restored prairies that the Native Prairies Association of Texas owns. We're probably looking at doing some more workshops down in the Fayette Prairie area. So this one will probably occur in Brenham. That one's going to be September 29th, and it's hosted by the Fayette Prairie chapter of the Native Prairies Association of Texas. Mark Brown is actually a Gideon Linscomb chapter member, or was historically. And so those are occurring. We're looking at doing one potentially at the McGregor Research Station with AgriLife Extension. They just planted 90 acres of native grass on some former row crop and looking to do some more in the future, cooperating with us. The Rolling Plains Quail Research Ranch in Roby, Texas will have field days every quarter. They have a Facebook page that you can follow. That they do a lot of work on. I know they do field days out at the Matador Wildlife Management Area near Paducah, Texas. That can focus on a lot of these same range management principles. I believe that's a 22 or 26,000 acre wildlife management area where they've done a ton of prairie restoration on a very big scale. Removing cedar trees, doing prescribed burns, removing mesquite, and so on. And so there's lots of folks scattered around. There's lots of resources around. I think that West Texas Rangelands Facebook page does a good job of capturing some of that. The prairieproject.org has a Facebook page that does a pretty good job of capturing a lot of these things as well. Dr. Megan Clayton, we're actually going to have our plant party here in 2 weeks. She and I have done some work together on some of these things as well. She's a great resource too. So, well, we've lost about 160 people, so they're probably tired of hearing me talk.
I was just going to say, I think that's a great way to wrap it up with all these other resources that folks can spend some time looking at and resourcing. Tim, thank you so much for doing this for us today, especially on your birthday. I mean, who doesn't want an hour to talk about plants on Tim Sigmund's birthday?
Well, I'm happy to be a part of it. And if I can help again, let me know in some way and I'll see what we can do.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And thank you to our Master Naturalists. We'll get this recording posted by the end of the day, if not tomorrow morning.
Thank you both. And thanks everybody for coming. Y'all take care.
Thanks, everyone.